We've covered everything from food to affordable housing. Across the last 6 years, if it had to do with childhood poverty, we told you the impact it had on local children.
If we're counting by tens, it would be what?
We found that we have a community of meaningful change makers, and we learned that change takes time, sometimes generations. Then the pandemic and calls for racial justice brought to light even deeper issues. We learned that the status of childhood poverty is not the result of private decisions by private people. It is the product of government action over the decades.
And it's largely tied to the idea of building wealth through home ownership, like right here in the West End. Now, there's no literal red line painted on the streets here in the West End, but this community was redlined. So, what is redlining? What was its history here in the Queen City? Some may call it a forgotten history, but we're not in the business of forgetting. We're in the business of history telling.
Redlining goes back a really long time.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Back to 1933 as part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal plan to address the Great Depression. Programs were created for relief, reform, and recovery. The Federal Housing Administration was established in 1934 to increase America's housing stock, and it explicitly segregated America's housing.
African Americans were officially excluded from that program. It was a program for whites only. So there was a huge increase in home ownership after World War II.
Because the FHA required that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. It left African Americans and people of color out of these new post-war suburbs and pushed them into urban housing projects.
Redlining was the historical practice of basically cutting off whole communities to financial services, to say basically, hey, financial institutions do not do business in this particular area.
Thus taking a red pen to a map and drawing a line.
We're going to draw a big red line around this block or this neighborhood and say it's too risky. So communities that were in the red line were thought of as to be high risk. So if it's high risk for mortgage lending, commercial lending, access to other amenities, green spaces, public accommodations, all those things happened, and it was perfectly legal at the time.
That was the beginning of a high level of home ownership among white people in the United States, but black people were left out.
Signs on water fountains, restrooms, and restaurant counters are the most visual way we've shown segregation over the years. But the truth is, housing policies have been one of the strongest tools of the last 100 years used to segregate whites and blacks.
The most glaring example is the FHA homeowner program after World War II. So that was a huge program trying to increase home ownership, focused largely on people returning from the war and people working in the war industries. But African Americans were officially excluded from that program. It was a program for whites only.
That's just the start. Then there were things like zoning, block busting, steering, and restrictive deeds or covenants. Zoning regulated the use of land for whites. Blockbusting was when a property owner was persuaded to sell property for less than its value because of the fear of another race moving into the neighborhood. Steering was used to keep some out of a community, and restrictive deeds included language that said no blacks could buy the home. And then there was redlining.
Redlining in its pure form was literally pre-computers, lenders and the people running the FHA program drawing red lines around certain areas where they were not going to make loans or use their program. And those red lines were around neighborhoods that had African Americans living in them. I mean, it is just straightforward exclusion based on drawings on a map.
This is not just Cincinnati's hidden secret. Look at these maps. It happened in Covington and Hamilton, and it happened all over the country, from Los Angeles to New York, Chicago to New Orleans.
In fact, the federal government was responsible for drawing those red lines. That's what redlining was. We saw the end of redlining, allegedly, in the 60s with the passing of the Fair Housing Act in 1968.
But the act was not the end of segregation. In 1968, none of the sources we checked knew the home ownership rates in Cincinnati, but currently in Cincinnati, black home ownership is at 33.3%. 73.4% of homeowners are white. We started this by telling you that redlining started back in the 1930s, but some who have studied redlining believes it goes back much further.
I think of redlining as a 200-year history of excluding African Americans from home ownership. And it really began in when Ohio became a state, and laws were immediately adopted that prevented black people from owning homes and real estate. Slavery was not permitted in Ohio in 1803, but there were many restrictions on black people. And one of those restrictions was they could not own real property, except in very limited circumstances.
How segregated is the Queen City? Local 12 worked with the University of Cincinnati Journalism Department to find out. We discovered it depends on how you look at the data. We analyzed every zip code in Hamilton County through what is called the Simpson Diversity Score. The score measures a population's density by race. A very low score means a community includes residents overwhelmingly from one race, either black or white. You can see here nearly half of Hamilton County's zip codes have an index indicating more than 75% of one race or another lives there. But UC data analyst Brian Calfano says the issue is too complex to draw any specific conclusions. He points out pockets of such segregation exist in almost all major cities, a lasting repercussion of redlining.
The top headline of here's the ranking of how segregated a particular place is really doesn't capture, I think, the whole story that's involved. I would back away from saying that we are some kind of poster child for segregated areas.
Case in point, the 45216 zip code, where I am now. It includes Elmwood Place, which is right here, as well as parts of Springfield Township. Now, on paper, it's one of the more diverse zip codes in Hamilton County. But in reality, it includes 3 or 4 neighborhoods, which can be either predominantly white or black. This area, and others like it inside Hamilton County, show the complexity of the data. People consider themselves part of a neighborhood or a city, not a zip code. That's what really makes a place, says Legal Aid Director John Schreider.
That's why you have to look at neighborhoods as neighborhoods. And, you know, it's one thing to look at a zip code. It's another thing to get in your car and drive around and look at the components of these zip codes.
No matter where Cincinnati stands nationally when it comes to segregation, fair housing advocate Janice Jones says segregation continues today, and it has a disparate impact on black communities.
Segregated communities who were segregated not by choice, but by design, not by accident, but by design, tend to see a lack of investment.
Coming up at 5, we'll compare how Cincinnati and Hamilton County compare to our sister cities in the Midwest when it comes to segregation. And then at 6, we'll dive deeper into just where the most segregated neighborhoods are inside the city limits of Cincinnati. In Elmwood Place, James Pilcher, Local 12 News.
We'll have that data he talked about as well as detailed explanation of our analysis at CincinnatiPoverty.com.